Hey guys, welcome back. In this episode, we'll follow a quiet, true account from a Hong Kong secondary school. In Hong Kong, people often say that schools do not entirely sleep at night. The buildings grow quiet, the fluorescent lights hum faintly, and the echo of hundreds of students fades away. But the classrooms themselves, those some believe are never truly empty. A caretaker once put it plainly, "You can lock the doors, but you cannot lock out the ones already inside." This story comes from one such place, a secondary school in Kowloon, the kind most of us would recognize. Narrow corridors painted in pale cream, stairwells lined with safety rails, a faint smell of disinfectant mixed with chalk dust. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening, and yet, as we'll hear, something about staying too late inside these walls carried a kind of quiet danger. Let's call our witness May. At the time, she was just 16, a diligent student, polite, unremarkable in the way most students are. But even before we speak of her, it's worth pausing on the warning that reached her ears. Students, especially those who study late, often trade small pieces of advice. Some are harmless. Don't sit under the air conditioning vent. Don't leave your textbooks in the open classroom overnight or else they might disappear. But others carry a sharper edge. May heard hers from an older classmate, whispered between exam revisions. Never stay behind in the classrooms after everyone's gone. Especially not on the top floor. The desks don't like being alone. She laughed it off at the time. Everyone does. The older student offered no explanation, no story to justify the words. Just a shrug, as if repeating a rule handed down many times before. But the phrase stayed with her. What does it mean for desks, wooden, ordinary desks, to not like being alone? The image alone is enough to leave a trace. A row of empty desks bathed in the blue glow of street lamps filtering through tall windows. The silence after the day's chatter, broken only by the click of pipes cooling in the walls. And somewhere inside that stillness, the suggestion of movement, of presence. Warnings like this are not unusual in Hong Kong. Folklore, superstition, and lived experience overlap until they are nearly indistinguishable. For generations, parents and teachers have advised children not to linger in liminal spaces, stairwells, toilets, locker rooms, and classrooms after dark. The reason is rarely explained in detail. Sometimes it is simply said, "It's not clean there." By not clean, they don't mean dust, they mean spiritually unclean. What makes a classroom spiritually unclean? Some point to the pressure of exams, the long hours of anxiety etched into the desks and walls. Others suggest that because schools are filled with young people, any untimely death nearby, an accident, an illness, even a suicide, might leave a lingering echo, an impression too strong to fade quickly. For May, the warning was background noise, an old superstition with no weight in her daily routine. She believed, as most of us do, that stories are stories and classrooms are just classrooms. But that was before the nights grew longer, and the building's silence began to feel less like quiet and more like something watching. This is where her account begins. May's days were not unusual. In many ways, that is what makes her story so unsettling. She was, by every measure, an ordinary student. She was 16, quiet in class but attentive, the kind of girl teachers described as reliable. She lived with her parents and younger brother in a modest apartment not far from the school. Her parents both worked long hours, her father in logistics, her mother in a nearby clinic. And that meant May often spent the afternoons and evenings managing herself. For her, staying late at school was not rebellion, it was practicality. The building itself encouraged it. Like many schools in Hong Kong, it was a mix of old and new. The lower floors were freshly painted, with glossy tiled corridors and buzzing LED lights, but the higher you climbed, the more you noticed the age. Hairline cracks in the walls, metal windows that no longer shut smoothly, ceiling fans that barely stirred the heavy air. May's classroom was on the 3rd floor. By day it was filled with sunlight and noise. By evening it grew pale and still, a hollowed-out shell of its daytime self. May did not mind. In fact, she preferred it. When the last bell rang, most students rushed out toward buses or MTR stations. May lingered. She straightened her notes, sharpened pencils, pulled a sweater from her bag in case the night grew cool. Then, once the halls had emptied, she opened her textbooks and began to study. There is something strange about a school after hours. Even those who have never believed in ghosts will admit this much. The soundscape changes. Every footstep echoes longer than it should. The pipes and beams produce quiet ticks and groans, as if the building itself is shifting. The smell of chalk dust seems sharper, the air thicker. May, sitting alone with only the glow of a desk lamp, noticed these things in a distant way but paid them little mind. She had a routine. At 5 p.m., she packed away her lunchbox and tidied her desk. By 6, she was deep into mathematics, the numbers reflecting faintly in her glasses. Around 7, she stretched her back, sipping water from a thermos, and listened to the occasional sound of a janitor moving a mop bucket down the hall. Those sounds were comforting, proof she wasn't entirely alone. Sometimes, when her concentration broke, she would glance at the windows. From the 3rd floor, she could see the housing estates nearby, rows of windows lighting up one by one, families settling in for dinner. A soft orange glow drifted across the cityscape, a contrast to the cold fluorescent light inside her classroom. It was during these quiet moments that the earlier warning, "Don't stay in empty classrooms after dark," occasionally surfaced in her thoughts. She would dismiss it quickly, telling herself it was just superstition, but the words had a way of replaying when the school was silent, when even the janitor had left. One evening, her mother called around 8:30, her voice tired but gentle. "Still at school? Don't stay too late, May. You'll catch cold." May promised she would leave soon. She meant it. She always planned to. And yet, the lure of quiet study, the absence of distractions, kept her seated longer than intended. She was determined to do well in her exams. If a little silence was the price, she would pay it. At least that's how she felt before the strangeness began, before silence itself became something else. The first strange thing didn't announce itself. It didn't slam a door or switch off the lights. It arrived the way most real stories do, quietly, almost politely, as if asking permission to exist. It was a Wednesday, 2 days after May had promised her mother she wouldn't stay too late. The sky outside the tall windows was the particular gray-blue Hong Kong gets before full night, a color that feels like it's holding its breath. From the 3rd floor, May could see the estate windows blinking on in a slow, domestic rhythm. Rice cookers, TV glow, silhouettes moving past curtains. Inside her classroom, the fluorescent tubes hummed a steady line of sound, a long-held note that faded into the bones of the room. Chalk dust clung to the blackboard in light strokes, as if remembering earlier lessons. May's routine felt intact. Mathematics open, notebook squared neatly to the table's edge, a sweater pulled over her shoulders against the artificial chill. She had tied her hair back for focus. The faint tang of disinfectant drifted in from the corridor. A janitor must have mopped earlier. Around 7:10 p.m., as she paused to underline an equation, a chair scraped in the classroom next door. It was an ordinary sound, the kind she'd heard 100 times during the day. Rubber feet dragging against tile, wood echoing slightly. Only now, at this hour, the sound stood alone in the empty corridor, unaccompanied by chatter or movement. May lifted her head and waited. Silence swelled back in, full and glassy. She stared at the doorway across the hall, where the neighboring classroom's glass panel showed a narrow strip of darkness. No shadows moved. No voices followed. The building breathed its little metallic clicks. She could have ignored it, and she tried. She put her eyes back on the page, but the sound had a quality that didn't sit neatly. It was not the accidental bump of a chair shifting on its own, not the thud of a book sliding off a stack. It had intention in it, a slow pull, a pause, and then a small settling, the way you move a seat back from a desk before you sit. Her phone buzzed with a message, a reminder from a class group about practice questions, and the ordinary glow of the screen felt like fresh air. She typed a quick reply. "Still at school. We'll finish Q5. She added an emoji she didn't feel. When she looked up, the room seemed a little different. Not in a way she could name. The air felt denser, as if the hands on the wall clock were pushing through water. She listened for footsteps in the corridor, for that easy evidence of a person. Nothing. The hum of the lights, the distant hiss of traffic, a faint vibration from somewhere in the building's plumbing. May told herself it was the wind. The old metal windows didn't seal properly. Drafts slipped in and tugged at things. It was, she thought, just the building settling. She stood, more to prove it than out of curiosity, and walked to the door. Her shoes made that hollow school floor sound, clean, small, and too loud in a quiet hallway. She leaned into the corridor. The neighboring classroom's door was half closed, the kind of careful angle teachers leave when they expect to return. Through the narrow glass panel, she could see rows of desks washed in the blue light leaking from the window. No movement, no one standing. The stillness looked staged. May pushed her own door wider so it wouldn't click shut behind her, and took 3 steps into the corridor. The air felt cooler there, the smell of detergent stronger, as if the floor's clean surface were giving off its own chill. She listened, a patient kind of listening that makes your ears ring. The building replied with silence, the kind that seems to press back. A light thud came from the neighboring room. Not loud. Like a textbook dropping from a modest height, a knee's length, not a table's. May's fingers tightened around the doorframe. She heard herself whisper, a reflex she didn't mean to speak aloud. "Hello?" No answer. Of course there wouldn't be. Who would call back at this hour? If it was a janitor, they would have answered, or the trolley wheels would have rattled. If it was a teacher, there would be a cough, a shuffle, "Who's there?" But there was only that same pale silence drawing long across the hallway. May's phone vibrated again. The sudden, familiar tremor startled her more than the thud had. She exhaled, almost laughing at herself, and stepped back into her classroom. She closed the door not fully, leaving the latch resting soft, an in-between gesture that felt safer than either extreme. At her desk, she tried to re-enter the problem set, to stitch concentration back over the small tear the noise had made. The numbers wouldn't hold. Her pencil rolled once, slowly, until it touched the spine of her notebook and stopped. She noticed a strand of hair loose against her neck and brushed it away with the back of her hand. The skin of her fingers felt cooler than a moment before. The wall clock ticked, a faint, dry sound, and she realized she'd never really heard it in this room before, not during the day. It was too quiet now. The tick landed like a bead, dropping into a bowl of water. She counted 3, and then the sound made its own rhythm in her head, a second heartbeat she wished would stop. Enough, she told herself, not out loud. A chair scraping next door, a soft thud, a clock, none of it unusual. She would pack at 7:30, go home, eat, sleep. She looked at the windows to anchor herself. The estate lights were warmer, the pattern of dinners and TV shows continuing, as if the city itself were reassuring her. Before she could close the math book, the faintest line of chalk dust loosened from the edge of the blackboard and fell. A barely there snowfall that collapsed the moment it was born. It was nothing, a draft, a cough of the room. May watched the powder settle into the tray and felt the smallest lift along the skin of her arms, not quite a shiver. The air smelled suddenly more like chalk than disinfectant. She stayed 10 more minutes, not to be brave, but to prove to herself that time still moved normally, that the room would return her to the ordinary if she waited. When she finally stood to leave, her chair legs touched the floor with a careful sound, as if she were trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. In the corridor, she pressed the switch and watched the classroom light die into the gray-blue from the windows. For a second, the room looked deeper than it should have, as though the corners had pulled back. Then she locked the door, checked the handle, and told herself she'd imagined that too. On the stairs down, a janitor passed her, pushing a trolley. He gave a small nod. "So late," he said, friendly, not accusatory. "Just today," May answered, a smile she didn't feel reaching for the right shade. He glanced toward the 3rd floor, then back at her. "Don't study too hard," he said. A simple sentence, common in this city, but the way the words hung in the stairwell made her think of the earlier warning again, the one about the desks. Outside, the night had settled properly. May inhaled the damp air, bus exhaust, sidewalk kitchens, the metallic scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The world felt normal again. She decided, sensibly, that the chair and the thud were nothing worth telling anyone about. She also decided, less consciously, that she would come back tomorrow, just to prove to herself how ordinary the evenings were. And that is how the second night begins. The next evening arrived with the same rhythm as all the others. School ended, corridors emptied, voices dissolved into the city's background noise. May followed her routine almost without thought. Tidy her desk, refill her thermos, pull the sweater over her shoulders as the air conditioning cooled the halls. If the memory of the scraping chair and the soft thud had unsettled her, she didn't show it, not even to herself. Like many ordinary people, she leaned on reason. Buildings make noises, furniture shifts. Perhaps a janitor had been in the next room without her noticing. It was easier to file it away than to dwell. Still a trace of unease followed her, the kind you don't hold in your mind but in your body, a slight stiffness in her shoulders, a tendency to glance up at the clock too often, the way she kept her phone close on the desk as if its glow were a talisman. That night the weather had shifted. The air outside carried the smell of rain, metallic and sharp, even before drops touched the ground. Inside, the classroom windows sweated faintly with condensation, and the fluorescent tubes buzzed louder than usual, like tired insects. May sat in her usual place, 2nd row from the front, and tried to press herself into the familiar grooves of mathematics. At 6:45, she paused, pencil hovering. The corridor outside was quiet, except for one sound: footsteps. They were not hurried, not the light patter of a student running late. These were measured, steady. Heel, then toe. Heel, then toe. pacing the corridor with a calm regularity. May looked up. Through the glass panel of the classroom door, the hallway appeared empty. The lights were still on, but no shadow crossed. She listened more closely. The steps moved toward her door, then paused. The silence that followed was thick, as if the building itself were holding its breath. May's pulse ticked higher. She turned back to her notebook, forcing her eyes downward, telling herself she was imagining things. And then the footsteps resumed, this time softer, fading toward the stairwell, until they disappeared altogether. She swallowed. Her throat felt dry, though her thermos was full of water. She considered packing up early, but resisted. Leaving too soon would make the noises feel like a victory. She refused to give them that weight. Still, she found herself glancing at the blackboard. The chalk marks from earlier lessons seemed faintly disturbed, smudged in a way she didn't recall. A few white streaks arched upward, faint as fingerprints dragged through dust. She blinked, leaned closer. When she focused, the lines looked ordinary again, like any classroom board after a long day. The hour crept forward. At 7:20, her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Dinner's in the fridge. Don't stay out too late." May typed back a quick reply, fingers tight on the keys. "Leaving soon," but her eyes lingered on the doorway. She told herself she'd wait just 10 more minutes, finish the last problem, close the book properly so the day felt complete. A small compromise with her own unease. At exactly 7:30, she heard it again. Not footsteps this time, something closer. A faint shuffle as though fabric brushed against a desk. The sound came from within her own classroom, though she sat alone. Her pencil stopped moving. The silence that followed was absolute. May's skin prickled as if the air had turned colder, though the fans still spun their lazy circles overhead. She looked down the rows of desks. Each was empty, perfectly still, bathed in the pale light. But the sound, that small, dragging shuffle, replayed in her ears, as real as her own breathing. May inhaled carefully, packed her books and stood up. This time she did not wait to prove anything. She told herself she was simply tired, nothing more. But as she turned off the light and closed the door, she caught her own reflection in the glass panel. Wide-eyed, shoulders tense, as if the building had already taught her something she wasn't ready to admit. That was the second night, the last time she would mistake unease for coincidence. By the third evening, the routine itself had become heavier. May still told herself the noises were nothing unusual. Chairs settle, chalk smudges, footsteps echo, but when she returned to the classroom, the act of sitting down no longer felt neutral. It felt like entering into a quiet agreement with the room. "I'll stay, but please, nothing tonight." That night the weather had shifted again. The city outside was wet with drizzle, the air dense and sticky. The smell of rainwater rose from the playground, mixing with chalk dust and the faint metallic tang of damp iron rails. From her window, May saw the estate towers shining like columns of light, their windows blurred by droplets streaking the glass. Inside, the classroom fluorescents hummed unevenly, one bulb at the back flickering in a nervous rhythm. She sat at her usual desk, pulled her sweater close, and tried to ignore the restless flicker. Numbers lined her notebook, but her eyes drifted often to the blackboard. Something about its empty, dark surface seemed too watchful, like a pond holding its reflection too still. The clock ticked into the half hour when it began. At first, it was temperature. May felt it in her hands, the pencil colder against her skin, the air pressing cool across the nape of her neck. She rubbed her fingers together, puzzled. The air conditioning had been turned off hours ago. There should have been only the stagnant warmth of the building. Yet here she was, shivering. Then came the sound. Not from the corridor this time, nor from the neighboring classroom. It came from inside her own. A faint breath of chalk across slate, the sound of writing, deliberate and steady. May froze. She looked up. The blackboard was blank. No hand moved across it. No chalk rested in the tray. But even as she stared, the sound continued, a faint skirk, skirk, like marks being dragged into existence. Her chest tightened. She whispered to herself, "Stop it." Not to anyone in particular, but as if naming the fear might make it dissolve. The sound ceased. Silence returned, but silence with edges. May pressed her hands flat on the desk, grounding herself. After a moment, she leaned forward. That's when she saw it. Faint lines appearing on the board, too pale to be fully words, but not random either. Curves, strokes, fragments of characters forming slowly as though drawn by an invisible hand. The chalk tray remained still, no dust stirred, and yet the strokes deepened until one line became unmistakable, the vertical spine of a character, stark against the slate. May's heart thudded. Her breath misted faintly in the sudden cold. She grabbed her phone and held it up, camera trembling. But when she looked through the lens, the board showed nothing, only a blank black surface. Lowering the phone, the faint white strokes reappeared. Looking back through the screen, they were gone. Her chair creaked as she stood, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. She didn't dare approach the board. Instead, she whispered, "Enough." The word left her lips in a thin, breaking thread. The cold deepened once more, as if the classroom had inhaled. And then, just as suddenly, it lifted. The temperature returned, the chalk lines softened, faded, disappeared back into nothing. May backed toward the door, eyes fixed on the board until her hand found the handle. She stepped into the corridor without looking away, then closed the door firmly behind her. Downstairs, in the humid night air, she told herself she must have been imagining it. Fatigue, stress, light playing tricks. But her skin remembered the cold, and her ears remembered the sound of chalk writing without hands. That was the night she realized the warnings might not be superstition. Something in the classroom wanted to be noticed. By the fourth evening, May's nerves had shifted. She was no longer brushing the incidents aside as easily, yet she returned anyway. That was the strange part. Fear and curiosity, or perhaps stubbornness, carried her back up those stairs, into the quiet corridor, and into the classroom that had grown colder in her memory. She told herself she wanted to prove it was nothing. That logic and routine would anchor the strangeness back into normal life. But another part of her, the part she didn't admit even to herself, wanted to see what happened next. This time she wasn't alone. A friend came with her. Let's call her Yan, another student preparing for exams. Yan had heard May's unease in passing and offered to stay behind with her, joking, "At least if there's a ghost, we'll get better marks for bravery." Together, the two girls settled into the classroom around 6:30 p.m. The room felt different with two bodies inside. The silence less absolute. They talked quietly at first, their voices bouncing against the tile floor, filling the space that had been so hollow the night before. For a while it felt ordinary again. At 7, The ordinary crack. Yan had pulled out her phone to play music at low volume. As she scrolled through her playlist, the phone screen stuttered. A momentary static flicker, as though a signal had passed through it. She frowned. Weird. May, watching, felt her stomach tighten. She knew that flicker too well. It reminded her of the board disappearing when she tried to film it. Yan, curious, turned the camera on, lifting it toward the rows of desks. Maybe we'll catch something, she said lightly, half in jest. The lens panned across the room. Nothing unusual appeared. But when they played the clip back seconds later, the image warped. For the first 3 seconds, the recording showed only their classroom, but then, in the middle row, a figure appeared, faint, blurred, seated as if it had always been there. No detail could be made out, no face or clothing, just the unmistakable outline of someone sitting at a desk, slightly hunched, as though bent over a book. May felt the blood drain from her face. Yen went pale too, though she tried to laugh it off. Maybe glitch, she said, voice thin. But her hands tightened around the phone and she didn't record again. They sat frozen, replaying the video over and over. Each time the blur remained, seated in silence, unmoving. The air in the classroom grew noticeably colder, a thin draft coiling around their ankles. Yen whispered, "Did you feel that?" May nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. Neither of them dared to approach the middle row. The desks looked empty to the eye, but the video had carved a doubt into the space. As if reality itself had slipped for a moment, letting something bleed through. They lasted 10 more minutes before Jan insisted they leave. May agreed at once. Together they packed their books hurriedly, their movements clumsy and loud, as though noise might defend them. At the doorway, May glanced back one last time. The rows of desks were neat, untouched, lined in the same pale fluorescent wash, but in that stillness, she felt with certainty that they were not alone. That was the night the story left the realm of imagination. No superstition, no chalk dust, no nerves. Now there was evidence. Something caught, however faintly, on camera. Something that could not be explained away so easily. Stories do not grow in a vacuum. They take root in whispers, in fragments of history passed quietly between those who work late, who clean the corners, who know the building after the last bell has rung. For May, the strange nights in her classroom might have remained unexplained, chalk that moved on its own, a figure caught in blurred pixels, if not for a chance encounter. It happened 2 days later. May, still shaken, had sworn not to return after dark. But her mother's shift ended late, and May waited near the school gate for her to pick her up. The courtyard was almost empty, the sky thick with clouds that pressed down against the fluorescent yard lamps. Only one person remained near the entrance, the janitor, a man everyone simply called Uncle Wong. He was older, his back slightly stooped, his cart heavy with mops and buckets. May had seen him often, but rarely spoken more than a polite greeting. That evening, perhaps sensing her unease as she lingered by the gate, he approached with the unhurried steps of someone used to the night. "You stay late too much," he said, not unkindly. May forced a smile. "Just studying." Uncle Wong's eyes lingered on her face, then glanced toward the upper floors of the building. His voice lowered. "Classrooms are not good places after dark, especially that one you like." May's stomach nodded. She hesitated before asking, "Why? People always say that, but why?" He studied her a long moment, weighing whether to answer. Finally, with a sigh, he leaned lightly against his cart. "Many years ago, before your time, a boy stayed late in that room. Exam season, like now. Worked too hard. Some say his heart gave out. Others say something darker. Doesn't matter. They found him the next morning, still sitting at the desk. He never went home." The words fell simply, without drama, but May felt the air tighten around them. She could almost see it, the dim glow of early morning, a body slumped over papers, the silence of discovery. Uncle Wong continued, voice steady. "After that, teachers avoided staying late on that floor. They said when the building grows quiet, you can still hear his chair scrape, or see writing on the board that no one remembers putting there. I've heard it myself." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, as though testing if May would laugh. But May didn't. She felt her chest sink. "You've seen something?" she whispered. The janitor nodded once. "Once, many years ago. Thought I saw a boy sitting in the row near the window. I called out, but he didn't answer. When I looked again, the desk was empty. After that, I finished my cleaning faster." His words carried no exaggeration, no embellishment, just the weary tone of someone who had long accepted certain facts of the building. He straightened, pushing his cart toward the gate. "Don't stay late, girl. Books you can read anywhere. But if a place doesn't want you there, better to listen." May stood frozen as he walked away, the echo of the cartwheels fading into the night. For the first time she felt the weight of the classroom's history pressing on her shoulders. The noises, the writing, the figure in the recording, suddenly they no longer belonged to imagination. They belonged to a story rooted in the building itself, a story that had been waiting quietly for anyone foolish enough to linger, and May had lingered. After Uncle Wong's quiet warning, May never returned to the third-floor classroom. She didn't need to. The place had already followed her home. At first it was subtle. She studied at the dining table now, surrounded by the comfort of clattering dishes, the drone of TV dramas, and her brother's cartoons. But when the apartment grew quiet, when her parents fell asleep, and her brother's light finally clicked off, she noticed it, a sound beneath the silence. The faint scrape of a chair leg across tile. She told herself it came from upstairs neighbors, or perhaps the table shifting as wood expands with the night air. But the sound was too familiar. The same rhythm she had heard in the classroom. That slow drag, the pause, the soft settling. Each time it came, her hands froze over her books, her breath shallow. Then came the chalk. Not on the wall itself, but in her dreams. She would see it clearly. White lines forming across a blackboard. Strokes without a hand to guide them. Words she could almost read, but never quite. Each morning she woke to a faint taste of chalk dust on her tongue, dry and bitter. Her textbooks began to feel out of place too. More than once she found them shifted slightly from where she had left them the night before. Pages she hadn't studied yet were folded open, as though someone had been looking at them in her absence. When she asked her younger brother if he had touched them, he shook his head. Her parents never entered her room while she studied, and yet the movements continued. Quiet, deliberate. Jan, who had once joked about ghosts, grew distant. One evening, May asked if she still had the recording. Jan shook her head quickly, avoiding eye contact. "I deleted it," she said. I don't want him finding me." She would not explain further. That word, him, chilled May. They had never once spoken of the figure as a boy, never given it identity, but Jan's certainty left no space for doubt. By then, May had stopped sleeping well. Shadows lengthened at the edges of her room, and she began leaving her lamp on through the night. Still, the noises came, the scrape of chairs, the faint drag of chalk. Sometimes she thought she heard papers turning, faint as a breath. She tried headphones, music, anything to muffle it. Nothing worked. The worst came one evening, weeks later. May sat at her desk at home, exhaustion pulling at her. Her brother wandered into the room, half asleep, rubbing his eyes. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a long moment before speaking. "Gee, why are you whispering to him?" May's pencil slipped from her hand. Her throat closed. She had not spoken a single word. When she turned toward her brother, ready to deny it, his small face was pale. His eyes were fixed, not on her, but on the empty chair pulled up beside her desk. The one she never remembered moving. Even outside May's experience, her story echoes what many in Hong Kong quietly know. Schools are not empty places. They carry both memory and pressure, and in traditional belief, those things leave a residue. In Chinese culture, certain spaces are described as jing, not clean, but not in the sense of dirt or dust. It means spiritually unsettled. Classrooms after dark fall into this category. By day, they are filled with noise and movement. By night, they become hollow shells, their silence absorbing the anxiety of thousands of hours spent inside them. This thinning of energy, many say, makes them vulnerable to lingering spirits. Particularly powerful are stories of students who died young. A sudden or unfinished death is thought to bind a soul to the place of its greatest struggle. In a city like Hong Kong, where exam stress is as much a fixture of life as the MTR, classrooms naturally become the sites of these hauntings. That is why parents still warn their children, don't stay behind too late. Not because the floor is unsafe or because the janitor needs to lock the gate, but because these rules serve as quiet protection. They remind the living not to invite what belongs to the other side. May's classmates began following the same habit. No one stayed late anymore. They never said why, but they didn't need to. The story had already worked its way into the culture of the building. Just one more echo in a city filled with them. What happened to May? The sounds, the writing on the board, the blurred figure on video, the whispers at home, can be seen in two ways. From a cultural perspective, it fits precisely within Hong Kong's long tradition of school hauntings. The noises, the cold air, the persistence of the presence even after she left. All of these are signs of a spirit unwilling to move on. If we take Uncle Wong's account seriously, then perhaps the boy who once died there never left his seat. Perhaps, in moments of silence, he still searches for answers in notebooks that no longer exist. From a rational perspective, there are other explanations. Stress is a powerful force. Exam season pushes students into exhaustion, where imagination and reality blur. Old buildings creak, lights flicker, pipes expand and contract. Camera glitches can create ghostly shapes, and whispers at night may be nothing more than the mind replaying what it fears most. But there remains the final moment. Her brother asking who she was speaking to, his eyes fixed on a chair she did not remember moving. That detail resists dismissal. Was it coincidence? Suggestion? Or something darker? A presence that had followed her home? Stories like this are not told to frighten, but to remind us silence is not always empty. The line between diligence and danger, between ordinary study and something else, is thinner than we want to believe. So, what do you think happened? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true ghost stories from across Asia.